The San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, in the late autumn of 1887, were a place where ambition went to be tested and frequently to die. The peaks rose above 13,000 feet in jagged, mineral-dark formations that had drawn prospectors and mining companies in waves since the silver strikes of the early 70s, and the valleys between those peaks held towns that had sprung up around ore veins and now clung to existence with the particular stubbornness of communities built on extraction. The air at 9,000 feet was thin and dry and carried cold the way wire carries current, not gradually but instantly, completely, with a sharpness that settled into the bones of anyone who stood still for more than a minute. Snow came early in the San Juans. It came heavy, and it stayed, sometimes from the first week of October until the middle of May, burying roads and closing passes and turning every settlement into an island surrounded by white. The town of Garnet Fork sat at 8,900 feet in a narrow valley carved by a creek that ran copper-colored from the tailings upstream. It was not a large town, perhaps 200 souls in the winter months, swelling to 300 or more when the passes opened and the seasonal miners returned. But it had a general store, a company assay office, a livery, a boarding house run by a woman named Petra Strand, who tolerated no drunkenness under her roof, and a collection of cabins and frame houses that lined both sides of the main road for roughly a quarter-mile before the forest closed in again. The mines that fed the town were scattered along the ridgelines to the north and west, some active, some played out, some abandoned so recently that the timber framing inside them was still pale and smelled of fresh-cut pine. By November of 1887, most of the seasonal men had left, the pass to Silverton was closed, and the people who remained were the ones who had decided, or been forced by circumstance to decide, that this was where they would spend the winter. It was in the second week of November, with the first heavy snow already on the ground and the second approaching from the northwest, like a gray wall being drawn across the sky, that a man named Orrin Hawk did something that no one in Garnet Fork had ever seen done, and that most of them, upon seeing it, immediately declared to be the action of a man who had lost the capacity for sound judgment. He moved his belongings out of the cabin he had been renting on the south end of town, loaded them onto a mule, walked a quarter-mile up the North Ridge Trail, and carried everything he owned into the mouth of the Lindstrom Tunnel, an abandoned silver mine that had been closed and left empty since the spring of 1885. The neighbors who watched him go said nothing at first. Orrin Hawk was not the kind of man who invited casual conversation. He was 36 years old, lean in the way that altitude and physical labor make a person lean, with a face that had been weathered past its years by sun and wind and the particular dryness of high country air. He had come to Garnet Fork 3 years earlier from a failed copper claim near Butte, Montana, and before that he had worked in the iron ranges of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and before that, though almost no one in Colorado knew this, he had spent 4 years of his childhood in a limestone mining settlement in Vestfold, Norway, where his father had worked as a blaster and his mother had kept their family alive through winters that made Colorado look moderate by comparison. He spoke little. He worked steadily. He had spent the summer of 1887 doing contract timbering for 2 of the active mines on the North Ridge, and he had been inside more tunnels in 3 years than most miners enter in 10, and he had noticed something about those tunnels that almost everyone else walked past without registering. He had noticed the temperature. The Lindstrom Tunnel ran roughly 200 feet into the north face of the ridge at a slight upward grade, following a vein of silver-bearing galena that had produced well for 3 years and then thinned to nothing. The tunnel was 6 feet wide and 7 feet high, timbered every 4 feet with lodgepole pine sets, and it was dry. The rock above it was dense enough to shed water to either side, and the floor was compacted stone dust that had hardened over 2 years of disuse into something close to pavement. It was, by the standards of abandoned mine tunnels, sound. The timbering was intact. The ceiling showed no sign of fracture. The ventilation shaft that had been cut 30 feet from the face still drew air, and the temperature inside at a depth of 100 feet from the entrance was 47 degrees Fahrenheit. In November, with snow on the ground and the outside air at 14 degrees and falling, 47 degrees. Orrin Hawk had checked it with a mercury thermometer he had borrowed from the assay office, and he had checked it again 2 weeks later and 2 weeks after that, and the number had not changed. 47 degrees in September, 47 degrees in October, 47 degrees in the first week of November, when the men at the boarding house were already feeding their stoves twice a night and waking to rooms where their breath hung visible in the gray pre-dawn air. The mountain did not care what month it was. The mountain held its temperature the way a stone holds the heat of a summer afternoon, slowly, massively, with a thermal inertia that no wooden structure built by human hands could begin to match. He had known this. He had known it since he was a boy in Norway, watching his father walk into the mine each morning and come out in the evening with his coat open, because the air inside the earth was warmer than the air above it. He had known it in Michigan. He had known it in Montana, and he had spent 3 months quietly, while the town prepared for winter in the way it always prepared, cutting wood, banking walls, sealing windows, stuffing rags into gaps, working out how to turn a piece of knowledge that everyone who had ever worked underground already possessed into something that could keep a man alive through a winter at 9,000 feet with less firewood than any cabin in the valley would require. The answer was not complicated. The answer was the tunnel itself. All he had to do was live in it. The work Orrin Hawk did in the 6 weeks before the heavy snow was precise, methodical, and almost entirely invisible from the outside. He began with the entrance. The mouth of the Lindstrom Tunnel was a rough opening in the rock face, 8 feet wide and 7 feet high, framed with heavy timber headers that had been installed when the mine was active. He reduced this opening. He built a wall across it, not a temporary barrier, but a permanent structure. Stone and timber and clay mortar, 18 inches thick at the base and tapering to 12 at the top, with a single door frame set into the left side and a window frame set into the right. The door was heavy pine planking, 3 inches thick, hung on iron strap hinges he had salvaged from the abandoned stamp mill downhill. The window was a single pane of glass, 10 inches by 14, set in a timber frame and sealed with pine pitch. The wall filled the mouth of the tunnel completely, and when the door was closed, the only light inside came from the small window and from whatever lamp or candle Orrin chose to burn. He sealed every gap in that wall with a mixture of ite clay and straw that he packed wet and allowed to harden. He hung a second door, a curtain of heavy canvas backed with a layer of stitched wool blankets, 6 feet inside the first door, creating a buffer between the outside air and the interior. This double entry was not an invention. It was a principle his father had described to him when he was 8 years old, sitting in the kitchen of their house in Vestfold, explaining why the mine entrance had 2 sets of doors in winter, because cold air is heavy and it flows like water, and if you give it one barrier it will push through, but if you give it 2 barriers with dead air between them, it loses its momentum and the interior stays still. Inside the tunnel, past the double entry, Orrin built his living space. He chose the section between 40 and 90 feet from the entrance, where the rock temperature was most stable and the ceiling was highest. He laid a floor of salvaged planking over the stone dust, not for warmth. The ground itself was warmer than any wooden floor in town, but for comfort and for keeping his belongings clean. He built a sleeping platform along the left wall, 18 inches off the floor, with a straw mattress and wool blankets. He built a simple table and bench against the right wall. He stacked firewood along both walls from the 90-foot mark back to the 140-foot mark, deep into the tunnel where it would stay dry and accessible all winter. 4 cords in total, which was less than half what any cabin of comparable size would need, because his firewood was not his primary source of heat. The mountain was his primary source of heat. The firewood was supplemental. The iron stove was the centerpiece. He had bought it in September from a family leaving Garnet Fork, a small box stove with a flat cooking surface, and he had installed it at the 50-foot mark with its flue pipe running upward at an angle to meet the ventilation shaft that the original miners had cut through the rock ceiling to the surface above. This shaft, roughly 8 inches in diameter and lined with fitted stone, served as a natural chimney. The draw was excellent. The temperature differential between the warm tunnel air and the cold surface air above created a draft that pulled smoke upward with a steadiness that no stovepipe on any cabin in the valley could match. The stove heated the air around it, yes, but more importantly, it heated the rock walls beside it, and those walls held that heat and radiated it back long after the fire had burned down to coals, and the coals themselves continued to radiate into the rock, and the rock continued to radiate into the air, and the system reached an equilibrium that Orrin Hawk understood intuitively, and that the science of thermodynamics would have described as a near-perfect thermal mass heating arrangement. The principle, stated plainly, is this: rock absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. Wood absorbs heat quickly and releases it quickly. A wooden cabin heated by a stove gains temperature fast when the fire is burning and loses temperature fast when the fire dies. A stone enclosure, and a mine tunnel is nothing if not a stone enclosure, gains temperature more slowly, but holds it with an obstinacy that has nothing to do with human effort and everything to do with the density and mass of the material itself. The mountains surrounding the Lindstrom Tunnel contained thousands of tons of rock. That rock had been absorbing the Earth's internal heat for longer than human beings had existed on the continent. The 47-degree baseline was not a temporary condition. It was a geological fact. And when Orrin added a small iron stove to that geological fact, burning a modest amount of wood in a space already insulated on 5 sides by solid stone, the result was a living space that maintained a temperature between 55 and 65 degrees through the worst nights of that winter, with a fraction of the fuel consumption that any wooden structure in Garnet Fork could achieve. He had not explained any of this to anyone. He had not attempted to justify his decision. He had simply done the work, moved his belongings, closed the door, and let the town draw its own conclusions. The conclusions the town drew were not kind. The first and loudest voice belonged to a man named Fletcher Caldwell, and Fletcher Caldwell was precisely the kind of man whose voice carries furthest in a small mountain town. He was 43 years old, a Pennsylvanian by birth, and he had come to Garnet Fork in 1880 as the construction foreman for the Consolidated Mining Company's surface operations. He had built or supervised the building of more than 30 structures in and around the town: cabins, bunkhouses, ore sheds, the company office, the original boarding house. And he had done this work well, with a craftsman's attention to joint and beam and insulation, and he had earned through that work a reputation as the man who understood how to build for winter at altitude. If you wanted to know how to seal a cabin against January at 9,000 feet, Fletcher Caldwell was the man you asked. He had watched Orrin Hawk carry his belongings up the ridge trail on that November afternoon, and he had said nothing until he was certain of what he was seeing. Then he had walked into the general store and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, that the Norwegian had finally done what 3 years of solitary work and solitary living were always going to lead to. He had gone to live in a hole in the ground like a badger, and when January came, he would either freeze to death or suffocate from his own stove fumes, and either way, someone would have to go up there in the spring and drag him out. Fletcher said this not with cruelty, but with the exasperated certainty of a man who has spent his life solving exactly the problem that someone else has just solved incorrectly. He said that mine tunnels were not shelters, that they were wet, unstable, poorly ventilated, and that any man who thought a hole in a mountain was warmer than a well-built cabin had never spent a winter in a well-built cabin. He said that cold air pools in low places and that a tunnel is the lowest place there is. He said that Orrin would burn through whatever wood he had stacked in there by Christmas and come back down the ridge looking for a room at Petra Strand's boarding house, and that Petra, being Petra, would give him one, and that would be the end of the experiment. The assessment spread through Garnet Fork, with the speed that only concerns about a neighbor's sanity can achieve in a town of 200 people with nowhere to go and nothing to do but wait for spring. By the end of November, Orrin Hawk's tunnel had acquired a name. They called it the Burrow. Children used it as a dare, who would walk closest to the sealed entrance and peer through the small window before running back down the trail. Men at the general store debated how long it would take before the cold or the dark or the loneliness drove him out. Women at the boarding house expressed the quieter, more practical concern that a man living alone in a mine tunnel was a man who was not well, and that someone should check on him, and that the someone should probably be Fletcher Caldwell, because Fletcher was the one who understood structures and what they could and could not withstand. Fletcher did not check. He had made his assessment, and he was satisfied with it, and he told anyone who asked that Orrin would come down when he was ready, and that going up there to tell him so would only delay the inevitable by giving the man someone to argue with. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known without walking into the tunnel and standing in it for 10 minutes, was that the temperature inside Hawks Burrow on the night of November 28th, with the outside air at 11 below zero and a wind coming down the valley that rattled every window in Garnet Fork, was 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Orrin Hawk had burned a small fire in the stove for 2 hours that evening. He had let it die to coals at 9 o'clock. At midnight, the temperature in his sleeping area had dropped to 54 degrees. He was under 2 wool blankets and he was comfortable, and the rock walls on either side of him were warm to the touch, not with the sharp warmth of a surface that has been heated and is now cooling, but with the deep, slow, patient warmth of a mass that has been warm for a very long time and has no particular interest in changing. December arrived and the winter settled in with the grim commitment that high-altitude winters bring to the San Juans. The snow accumulated, the passes stayed closed, the temperature dropped into the teens and then into single digits, and then, in the 3rd week of December, below zero for 9 consecutive days. The people of Garnet Fork burned wood. They burned a great deal of wood. The sound of axes splitting kindling in the pre-dawn darkness was as much a part of the town's winter soundtrack as the wind itself, and the wood piles that had seemed ample in October were visibly smaller by Christmas. And the men who had cut carefully were beginning to cut more carefully still, rationing the evening fires, banking the coals thicker, waking earlier to rebuild before the cabin temperature dropped below the point where the cold became something you could not ignore. Fletcher Caldwell's own cabin, a well-built structure, tight-joined and banked with earth to the windowsills, consumed nearly 7 cords of wood between November and the end of March in a typical winter. He kept the stove burning continuously from December through February, feeding it every 3 hours through the night, and even so the far corners of the cabin, the corners away from the stove, held a chill that no amount of burning could fully reach. This was normal. This was what winter was. Every family in Garnet Fork understood this arithmetic. Wood in, heat out, and the heat always leaving faster than you wanted it to, bleeding through every wall and window and gap between boards, escaping into an atmosphere that was vast and cold and utterly indifferent to the effort you had spent gathering it. Orrin Hawk was burning a quarter cord per month. He burned it selectively, in small fires that heated the stove and the surrounding rock for 2 or 3 hours at a time, and then were allowed to die. The rock held the heat. The sealed entrance held the air. The double entry prevented the cold from flowing in. The mountain itself, that enormous mass of stone surrounding him on 5 sides, maintained its deep geological temperature regardless of what the atmosphere above it was doing, and the small additions of stove heat accumulated in the rock walls the way deposits accumulate in a bank, slowly, steadily, building a reserve that could not be spent faster than it was earned, because the rock simply would not release it that quickly. By the middle of January, the interior of the tunnel, in the living section between 40 and 90 feet, maintained a steady temperature of 56 to 60 degrees without any fire burning at all. Orrin lit the stove in the morning to cook, and the residual heat from that cooking fire was enough to raise the ambient temperature 2 or 3 degrees, and those degrees held through the afternoon and into the evening, and by the time he lit the stove again for his evening meal, the tunnel had barely cooled. He was, in the most literal sense, living inside the earth's own warmth, supplemented by a quantity of firewood that any family in Garnet Fork would have considered laughably inadequate for a single month, let alone an entire winter. If you have stayed with this story, if you have followed the logic of what Orrin Hawk built and why it worked, then you already know what Fletcher Caldwell found when he finally went to see for himself. But the finding matters, because knowing something is true and standing inside the proof of it are different experiences, and the difference is what changes people. The confrontation that everyone had expected, Orrin Hawk stumbling down the ridge trail, half frozen, asking for a room, did not arrive in December. It did not arrive in January. By the first week of February, its absence had become conspicuous enough that people began to reconsider their assumptions, not because they had any new information, but because the simple passage of time without disaster is itself a kind of evidence. Orrin came down to the general store every 10 days or so for supplies. He was clean, he was unhurried, he did not have the look of a man who was suffering, and Fletcher Caldwell, who had spent enough winters at altitude to know exactly what suffering looked like, the hollowed eyes, the cracked hands, the particular hunch of a person who has been cold for so long they have stopped standing fully upright, could see none of it. It was Petra Strand who forced the issue. She caught Orrin at the store in the second week of February and asked him, with the bluntness that was her particular gift, whether he was planning to freeze to death in that tunnel or whether he had worked out something the rest of them had missed. Orrin looked at her for a moment and then said something that Petra repeated to Fletcher Caldwell that same evening and that Fletcher thought about for 3 days before he made the walk. What Orrin said was this: "The mountain does not get cold." Fletcher Caldwell climbed the ridge trail on a Sunday morning in mid-February. The temperature at dawn had been 9 below zero. He had been awake since 4, feeding his stove, and his cabin was warm enough, but it had cost him the last of his split kindling, and he would need to cut more before evening. He did not bring food or supplies. He brought his own thermometer. He wanted to see the number for himself, because the number was the thing he could not reconcile with everything he knew about building in winter, and Fletcher Caldwell was not a man who could leave an unexplained number alone. He knocked on the heavy pine door set into the stone wall that sealed the tunnel mouth. He waited. He heard footsteps on stone, not the hollow sound of boots on a wooden floor, but the solid, dense sound of boots on packed rock, and the door opened, and Orrin Hawk stood in the doorway with a tin cup of coffee in his hand and no coat on his body, and behind him the tunnel extended into lamplight and warmth and the quiet order of a man who has been living comfortably for 3 months in a place the entire town had declared uninhabitable. Fletcher stepped through the canvas curtain of the inner door and stood still. The air was warm, not tepid, not merely less cold than outside. Warm. It pressed against his face the way heated air presses when you step into a room where a fire has been burning for hours, except there was no fire burning. The stove was cold. The flue pipe, when Fletcher reached out and touched it instinctively, was cold. The warmth was coming from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, from the rock itself, from a source so large and so constant that it had no single point of origin. He took out his thermometer and held it at arm's length and watched the mercury climb. 57 degrees, in a space with no active fire, in February, at 9,000 feet, with 9 below zero on the other side of the door. He walked deeper. The temperature held. At 60 feet it was 58. At 80 feet it was 59. The walls were dry. The air was clean. The ventilation shaft drew steadily, exchanging air without exchanging temperature, a natural circulation that the miners who had cut it never intended to serve this purpose, but that served it perfectly. The firewood stacked along the walls from the 90-foot mark onward was barely diminished. 4 cords in November, and here in February more than 3 cords remained, dry and waiting and largely unnecessary. Fletcher Caldwell stood at the 80-foot mark of the Lindstrom Tunnel and pressed his hand flat against the stone wall and held it there. The rock was warm, not surface warm, deep warm. The warmth went into the wall further than his hand could reach, further than his understanding had prepared him to accommodate, and he stood there with his palm on the stone for a long time, long enough that Orrin Hawk said nothing and simply waited, because he understood what Fletcher was feeling and he knew it could not be explained, only felt, and that the feeling would do more work than any argument he could have made in November. Fletcher took his hand off the wall. He looked at Orrin. He looked at the thermometer still in his other hand. He said, quietly, with the particular weight of a man revising not just an opinion, but an entire framework of understanding, "I have been building wrong for 7 years." He did not mean that his cabins were bad. They were not bad. They were the best cabins in Garnet Fork, tight and well-made and as warm as wooden structures at 9,000 feet could be. What he meant was that he had been working from the assumption that winter was a problem of keeping heat in, that the solution was better walls and tighter joints and more fuel in the stove, and that this assumption, which had governed every structure he had ever built, was not wrong, but was incomplete in a way that the tunnel made suddenly, physically, undeniably visible. The mountain was warm. The mountain had always been warm. The mountain would be warm next February and every February for the rest of time, and every cabin he had built was a wooden box sitting on top of that warmth, fighting the air, burning fuel, when the answer was right there under everything, patient and constant and free. Orrin offered him coffee. Fletcher accepted. They sat at the table in a mine tunnel in February and drank coffee without coats, and the stove was cold and the mountain was warm, and neither of them said very much because there was not very much left to say. When Fletcher came back down the ridge trail that afternoon, he went directly to the general store, and he did not make a speech, and he did not issue a correction of his earlier assessment. He said to the men splitting kindling in the side yard that anyone who wanted to understand what Orrin Hawk had done should walk up there and feel the wall for themselves. He said the thermometer read 57 degrees. He said there was no fire burning. He said this in the flat, factual tone of a man reporting a measurement rather than defending a position, and the men who heard him stopped splitting and looked at him and understood from the quality of his voice that he was not joking and was not confused and was not being generous to a man he had once dismissed. 3 men went up the ridge the following day, 2 more the day after. By the end of February, every permanent resident of Garnet Fork who could make the walk had stood inside the Lindstrom Tunnel and pressed their hand against the wall and felt what Fletcher had felt. The visits changed nothing about that winter. It was too late to build, too late to move, too late to do anything but finish the season in the cabins they had and burn what they had left. But the visits changed something about how those people thought about winter, and thinking differently is the precondition for building differently. The following autumn, 2 families in Garnet Fork modified their homes to incorporate the principle Orrin had demonstrated. They did not move into tunnels. They dug into the hillside behind their existing cabins, extending their living space into the slope, building stone-backed rooms that used the earth as both insulation and heat source. Fletcher Caldwell supervised one construction and designed the other. He told anyone who would listen that the principle was simple and that he should have recognized it years ago, and that the Norwegian had done nothing more revolutionary than paying attention to something the earth had been doing since before there were people on it. Orrin Hawk lived in the Lindstrom Tunnel for 3 winters. By his second winter, he had added a deeper storage room and improved the entrance with fitted stone and a second window that caught morning light. By his third, he had dug a side chamber that served as a cold pantry, cooler than the main space but warmer than the outside air, holding food at a temperature that prevented freezing without any effort beyond the digging. He never argued for his approach. He lived it, consistently, quietly, and the consistency was the only argument he ever needed to make. He left Garnet Fork in the spring of 1891. The tunnel stood empty after he left, but not forgotten. Families used it for storage. The 2 hillside rooms Fletcher helped build survived and were occupied for more than a decade after Orrin's departure. Structures that owed their existence to a man who had walked into an abandoned hole in a mountain and recognized what everyone else had walked past, that the earth is warm, and that the simplest path to warmth is to stop fighting the air and start living closer to the stone. It is a peculiar habit of human thinking that we reach for complexity when simplicity is already beneath our feet. Every cabin in Garnet Fork was a sophisticated piece of craft, joints and beams and insulation and stove systems, all designed to manufacture warmth inside a structure that was fundamentally at war with the temperature outside it. Orrin Hawk walked past all of that engineering and into a hole in a mountain where the temperature had been stable for 100,000 years, and he put a door on it. There is something in that simplicity worth holding. The knowledge he used was not secret. Every miner who had ever worked a shift underground knew that tunnels are warm in winter. They knew it in their bodies. They stripped off coats as they descended. They felt the air change. They came out at the end of a shift into cold that shocked them because they had been warm for hours without noticing. The knowledge was there. It lived in the muscles and memory of every man who had ever worked below the surface. But knowing something in your body and building a life around that knowledge are two different things, separated by a gap that most people never cross because crossing it requires doing something that looks, from the outside, like you have lost your mind. If you are carrying knowledge like that, something that lives in your experience, but that you have not acted on because acting would look strange, because the people you respect would question it, because it runs against the way things have always been done, then this story may have landed at the right time. The people of Garnet Fork were not fools. Fletcher Caldwell was not a fool. They were working from the best framework they had, and the best framework they had did not include living inside a mountain because no one they trusted had ever done it. The gap between their knowledge and Orrin Hawk's was not a gap of intelligence. It was a gap of permission. The permission to take something you have felt in your hands and build around it, even when what you build looks, from the road, like a burrow. What are you walking past every day that already contains the answer? What do you know from experience that you have not yet allowed yourself to act on? The mountain was warm. It was always warm. Orrin Hawk did not make it warm. He stopped pretending it was not, and he built a door, and he walked in, and January could not reach him. The cold does not wait for your permission. Neither should you. There is something you already know that the people around you cannot see from where they stand. Build the door. Walk through. The mountain has been warm for longer than anyone has been arguing about it. It will hold. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in it named a thing you have been carrying, then this channel may have been built for someone like you. There is a story here every day, and the subscribe button is just below. And some of these stories have been waiting for exactly the person who would hear them. This story is a work of fiction. Orrin Hawk, Fletcher Caldwell, Petra Strand, and all other characters and events depicted are entirely invented. The thermal properties of underground rock mass and their historical use for shelter are real. The town of Garnet Fork is fictional. The story is not a historical account.